And we're good to go. Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, folks, depending on where you sit at. Welcome back to day 2 of our Multi-State Conservation Grant Program full applicant proposal informational webinar. Thank you for coming back. That's kind of one way the training branch always does an informal assessment of are we good or do we just put people to sleep. We always like to look how many people come back for day 2. And thank you very much for coming back. So we appreciate it. We know that this is often not the most exciting content to talk about, but we do appreciate your patience with us on it. Today is going to be more the financial assistance administration side of this informational training. Yona and Meg did a knock your socks off fantastic job yesterday introducing you to the service's new performance reporting system tracks and what steps might be required for you to tweak and modify your project proposal so that the service can hopefully put your grants, if you get awarded it, into tracks, and so we can now use the system to roll up and report on national accomplishments. So they did a great job there. Today we're going to kind of detour a little bit, and instead of focusing on tracks, we're just going to talk about more of the financial assistance side of the equation. We want to just remind folks of a few twists and turns, if you will, to help ensure that your full proposal is both complete, because we want to get your grant approved as soon as we can, as rapidly as we can. One of the best ways to do that is to get a complete and solid application right off of the bat, so that we don't have to come back to you and ask any questions and take away from your precious time. And we also just want to highlight a few important things to make certain you include in that application. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. We are recording this webinar just like we did yesterday, so be aware that the webinar is being recorded. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat at any moment during this presentation. Ask Yona and Meg and Mike to keep an eye on the chat, and if a question pops in, they'll just interrupt me and we'll address the question live in the heat of the moment. So do whatever you need to do to stay engaged. So all right, with that, I'll turn off my camera just to try and save a little bit of bandwidth for folks, but I'll still stay with you. Let's go ahead and jump right into the presentation, if you will. So right out of the back, congratulations. Why are you here with us today? You're here with us because AFWA, you submitted a preliminary or an initial proposal to AFWA. They reviewed it, they liked it, and they reached out to you, and you were one of a select few of folks that were asked to submit a full proposal for evaluation as part of the FY22 Multi-State Conservation Grant Program. So thank you very much for all your hard work and effort. If you're a repeat customer of the Multi-State program, we really love these programs and the great conservation work that they achieve. And we look forward to funding future projects and ensuring that these grant programs continue to be the best that they can and the money goes out there. So real quick, before I get in, I just want to highlight a couple important things. I pulled this off of the AFWA website. Just make certain you're aware of some important deadlines. Where are we at today? Well, we're at today, what is the date today? June 29th. And so about a week or two ago, you should have been contacted by AFWA saying that your initial proposal ranked high, and that AFWA now wants you to submit a full and more detailed grant proposal. So that's why we're here in front of you today. And note number 3, by July 20, 2021, so roughly middle of next month, that's when your full grant application proposal is due, both to AFWA. It must be submitted through their portal, as well as your full grant proposal must also be submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service, either through grants.gov or Grant Solutions. You can apply through either system. So remember that important date, July 20. Last thing we want to do is have you miss a deadline and then your proposal is perhaps not even reviewable because you submit it late. A couple other deadlines that are going to come after that. Once you submit the full proposals, by sometime in August, that's when the AFWA National Grants Committee is going to meet, and they will review all of the full grant proposals. They'll discuss them, they'll rank them, and then they will make a formal recommendation to the state directors as to which proposals they recommend for funding. The following month, September 21, that's when the state directors will hopefully formally approve the priority list of those grants and projects. And then if they approve that, they will then forward that priority list to the Fish and Wildlife Service on or around October 1st, 2021. That priority list then comes to the service. And then that gives us roughly 2 months or so for the service to begin doing what it needs to do to review and formally approve those projects in grant solutions. So our target date is we want to try and have approved grants out there beginning with a period of performance for you to rock and roll, get on the ground, the start of next calendar year. And you can really help us out by trying to submit a full application, a complete application package to us. That would really help us out. A couple other resources I want to point out to folks, if you're not already familiar with this, you may be, is AFWA's got a great link on their webpage again. They've got a great document titled Fiscal Year 22 Full Grant Proposal Guidelines. It's a really good document to download. Walks you through what is the requirements of a full grant proposal. The link right below it, they've got a link to a model template that you could use. It's not a requirement that you have to submit your project statements and your full proposal in the exact template that's there, but they sure do provide you a pretty slick and down to earth and good one to follow. So if you wanted to follow that template is there for you to use as you see fit. We'll talk in this webinar today about some required statements that you will need to make certain is included as part of your full grant proposal. So they've got a link to those required statements there, so feel free to check that out. And then lastly, the last resource I want to point you to on their website is the actual notice of funding opportunity for the fiscal year 2022 multi-state grant program. That is published annually by the WISPER program. We are required to publish a notice of funding opportunity for every discretionary grant program that we administer. So that's a really good resource to point to about eligibility requirements, what are the application requirements, what are the required documents that need to be included, and then also other legalese that may come into play with the multi-state program. So highly encourage everybody to read that NOFO. I know it can be long. I think that one is knocking around 30 pages or so. But it really does behoove everybody to read it to make certain that you are aware of any requirements, because the last thing we want you to do is to submit a complete application or, as I see Silvana type in the chat, submit a proposal that doesn't necessarily speak to the scoring criteria, and then maybe your proposal doesn't compete as well compared to others. So it's just a great way to make certain your project can compete as well as it can. A couple important things we want to talk about. For those of you who were on our informational webinar that we held earlier this spring, there's really a couple key things we want to make certain. If you're a state fish and game agency or a state agency for that matter who is used to applying for and receiving federal financial assistance grants or cooperative agreements, some of this stuff might be old hat to you. But if you're relatively new, if you're a nonprofit organization, you may not be familiar with this, so we do want to talk about things. But there are a couple key points to remember, some systems that you have to register in and get set up in before you apply for federal financial assistance, because if you're not in these systems, the service, the federal government, if you will, cannot approve any award application. So let's just talk about those real quick, a couple of them. First one we want to talk about is make certain that your organization has what is called a UEI, that's abbreviated for a unique entity identifier. And basically what this is the federal law and the regulations at 2 CFR 25 mandate that all applicants who apply for federal grants must, notice that word must, they must have a valid UEI, Unique Entity Identifier, as their universal identifier. So this requirement to have a valid UEI carries forward for recipients, and is also required if, in the case of your project, you plan to subaward all or part of your project to a subrecipient. Well, guess what, folks? Your subrecipients are required to have a unique entity identifier if they plan to receive subawards directly from you, functioning as the pass-through entity. So what is a UEI? Well, it's a unique 9-digit number that basically just verifies the existence of any business entity worldwide. Many businesses have multiple physical locations, so it's possible if you're part of that organization, you might have more than one unique entity identifier. Presently, you get a unique identifier. Some people might refer to it as a DUNS number, but it's one and the same. That's where you get it from. You get it from an organization titled Dun & Bradstreet. And again, most people call it a DUNS number. And you can obtain this DUNS number free of charge by going to their website. Typically, once you go to the website and you register for it, the DUNS number shows up as rapidly as 1 to 2 days, as long as you do it via their online portal. It's important to remember, get your DUNS number first, because the next system I'm going to talk about that you have to register in is called SAM, the System for Award Management. And in order for a applicant and a recipient to do direct business with the federal government, they have to have a SAM registration. But in order to get a SAM registration, one of the required fields is you're going to have to enter your entity's DUNS number. So you got to get the DUNS number first before you go into SAM. And you might ask, what's the point of all this? Some of the importances of the DUNS number is that is what federal awarding agencies use to search for entities in SAM to see, and we anticipate you're not one of these entities, but that's where we go into SAM to see if by some reason you are excluded, debarred, or otherwise prevented from receiving federal grant funds. So real quick, last bullet point I want to talk about. Next year, the federal government's going to move away from DUNS being the entity issuing unique entity identifiers, and the federal government is going to overtake that responsibility, and the unique entity identifier will soon be issued by SAM. When they begin taking that over, we're hearing word right now that the unique entity identifier is probably going to migrate away from a 9-digit number up to a 12-digit number. So just stay tuned. More information will come out as we hear about it. Presently, this transition is slated for April of 2022. Okay. All right, let's talk about the next system, SAM. I think I talked about it. In order to do business with the federal government directly, all applicants and recipients must register in the system of award management. And this system is basically the federal repository that houses information about applicants and recipients, again, who do business directly with the federal government. Unless you're waived, you must be registered in SAM prior to submitting a formal application for federal funding to a federal awarding agency. Once you have an active SAM registration, folks, just understand that you are required to maintain it and update it with information in SAM, at least on an annual basis, if not more frequently, if information about your organization changes. If you let your SAM registration expire, the Fish and Wildlife Service will not be able to issue you any new awards until you renew that SAM registration, as well as if you have any open existing awards and you let your SAM registration expire, we cannot approve any financial amendments to your approved grant while your registration is expired. So it's important to remember to have somebody in your organization monitor that and make certain you keep that SAM registration up to date. That's about all I want to say about SAM. Let's go over and talk about payments. Obviously, money makes the world go. It's very important to know how you go about and get money through federal grants. You applying through grants, folks, you guys will get your payments through a system called ASAP, the Automated Standard Application for Payments. This is operated by the U.S. Treasury. If you've never enrolled in ASAP before, or you've never been enrolled in ASAP under a Fish and Wildlife Service grant, then guess what, folks? The WSFR staff will initiate and facilitate your enrollment by sending you an ASAP enrollment form if you've never registered for ASAP. So again, if your full proposal is included in the priority list for funding and it moves forward, that is when you might see this communication from us as part of ASAP. But if you're already enrolled in ASAP, then no worries about it. We'll just use your current ASAP enrollment and things will go fine. But again, once completed, WSFR will initiate your enrollment by entering information on your behalf in ASAP, and then ASAP will notify your organization's point of contact about how to complete the final enrollment steps. Typically that stuff is entering your page, or excuse me, your bank account information and stuff like that. Once you're enrolled in ASAP, folks, good news. You can go ahead and begin incurring eligible and allowable costs under the grants once the period of performance start date happens. And guess what, folks? You can request payments under federal grants as frequently or as infrequently as you want. There's no need to send us invoices to the service to receive your grant funds. You just basically, the person designated as your payment requester goes into ASAP and requests a payment. So typically, once you request a payment, the funds are typically electronically deposited into your account the next business day. By golly, it's about one of the few things the federal government does very efficiently. The funds show up the next day. It's really important to remember, though, folks, that recipients, you must not, though, immediately on day one go in and draw all the funds down under your federal award. You're only supposed to draw down payments that minimize the time between the requesting of the funds and your subsequent disbursement of those funds. So again, look for additional information that'll be provided in your notice of award letter. And as always, if you have additional questions, there'll be some contact information at the end of this presentation that you can feel free to reach out to us and we can answer your questions. Another system you're going to have to register in is a system called Grant Solutions. The service adopted Grant Solutions as its official financial management software system back in May of 2020. Grant Solutions is a role-based system that allows the service and applicants and recipients to fully utilize and manage their grant awards throughout the entire duration of what we call in training branch the life cycle of the grant. So Grant Solutions is a system that allows applicants to search for and apply for funding. Once you apply for it and if you get approved, you can then fulfill your grant award requirements directly in Grant Solutions. You can submit performance reports. You can fill out the final financial report or any interim financial reports. If you're not registered in Grant Solutions, somebody in your organization will be required to do so prior to submitting a grant application in Grant Solutions. So in order to register, new users must complete what they call a recipient user account request form. And you'll see there's a link to it here on my slide, and we'll share these slides with you. And you submit that form to the Grant Solutions Help Desk. Real quick, we're not going to get into the meat and potatoes of this. But applicants, there's the ability to assign your staff up to 5 different roles in Grant Solutions, and each role has its own things that it's allowed to do and things it's not allowed to do. The highest level of user role, though, in Grant Solutions on an applicant side or recipient side is what is called the authorizing official or representative. That is the highest level role that your folks can get out there. So those are a couple things that we wanted to talk about real quick. Yona and Meg, did we have any questions about any of that before we really get into the meat and potatoes here?
Hey, Ryan. Yes, there were a couple of questions in the chat. So let's see, I'm just scrolling up a bit. So we have from Doug Austin, the Mulitstate Conservation Grant application portal specifically states that a completed template is the vehicle for the full grant proposal. That's not what the speaker stated. Can this be clarified? It looks like Silvana chimed in and said, please use the template. This will help reviewers score equally across 54 proposals. And the template has been adopted to include tracks requirements. So anything to add there?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. If that's what AFWA is highly encouraging and suggesting their folks to follow, I think that would be wise wisdom to follow that format.
Okay, and then we had another question from Tara Teal. Is SAM registration required for organizations, or is it for individuals applying for federal grants?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you are an individual applying for federal financial assistance grants or cooperative agreements, you are one of the select few who are waived from a requirement to have a SAM registration and even from having a unique entity identifier. However, if you are not an individual, then there is a select few number of entities who are waived. So I'm going to maybe pass the mic to Silvana. The question I would ask Silvana, will Multistate issue, are private individual citizens eligible applicants of the Multistate program? My understanding is no.
No, you wouldn't be eligible for that. You have
Right.
to be a nonprofit, state,
Right.
or state public university.
Right, yeah. So all the eligible applicants of the multi-state grant program would fit the criteria for being required to have a unique entity identifier and a SAM registration. So I hope that answers your question. Anything else, Jan?
Let's see, there was another question or comment from Doug. There also are no word limits on the specific components of the template like there have been in the past. Is there an 8-page limit on the final submitted document? If not, are there any other length limits that we need to address? It looks like Silvana chimed in and said no page limit, no word limit, but if you're writing a 10-page approach, put yourself in reviewer's shoes and tell me how you think that would rank. So any other comments to add?
Yeah, I think that's wise wisdom, Silvana. Thank you for saying that. We say a lot of the same in our training programs is, you know, unless there is specifically a page limitation mandated by the program in notice of funding opportunity or in AFWA's guidelines, I would mirror Silvana's comments is your application should be detailed enough to paint a clear and precise picture about what you're trying to do. But again, also remember that you know, the reviewers are not only reviewing your proposal, they're potentially reviewing, you know, 30, 40, 50 additional proposals. And the last thing you want to do is have a reviewer pick up an application that is 100 pages long and put them in a possible ill mood right out of the gate. That doesn't bode well. So what we always recommend in training is be detailed, be precise, but be concise. You know, the proposal should be absolutely long enough to clearly paint the entire picture about what you want to do and why it's so important that your project be funded. But don't just drag on and on and on. Try and be as concise as you can.
Hey Ryan, can I make a comment, question, kind of?
Please, yeah.
So when we put together NOFO, we hadn't really decided yet how we would go with tracks. And along these last few months, we have been working a lot on how to do tracks for this program, and therefore we had to adapt our template. So, and that's the reason why NOFO actually has a requirement of like 8 pages. And I don't know, Ryan, if that will like affect it or not. How do we deal with that?
Well, Silvana, I will defer that to you, being that I'm a trainer. I just grabbed that information because that was the language that was in existence in our notice of funding opportunity. So I will defer to you and John and Lori as to whether those page limitations are a hard and fast rule or whether there is some flexibility around those.
Okay. I don't know if Lori or John Strumpel are here today.
Yeah, I'm here, Silvana. This is John Stremple. I wouldn't think there's a really hardcore page limit. Really, you wouldn't want to go too far beyond maybe 8 pages, but you know, like Ryan was saying, you don't want to get too long.
Yeah. All right. So it sounds like there is a little bit wiggle room, but I think what I would encourage applicants is, you know, the NOFO is definitely providing you some suggested limitations on how far, how long your project statement should be. I would encourage folks try to stick within those deadlines, but if you absolutely need more space to do it, it definitely sounds like John and Silvana are saying that definitely won't immediately knock you out of the running, is kind of where we're at. Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Anything else?
That was it. There was just one other question about the project title limit for tracks, and we put in the chat 1,000 character limit. So that's pretty generous, I think, for the titles. You should when we've tried to put in example titles, we haven't run out of space. So that's just for tracks, the limit of characters for a grant or project title.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, I think 1,000 characters is pretty generous in a title. So, okay, well, let's move on to your full proposal and what must it all contain. Again, you know, folks, remember, you know, I used to apply for grants when in a previous life when I worked for a state agency. You definitely want to make certain your application is attractive and complete. You know, the last thing you want to do is submit an incomplete package right out of the gate, and then we have to re-engage with you and get additional information. We know you're busy. We're busy. We're just trying to be as efficient as we can. So what constitutes a full proposal for the multi-state grant program is you'll see these various resources we have on the screen, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about them. But basically, you're going to have to submit as part of your full proposal an SF424. Some folks might know that as the AFA, abbreviated for Application of Federal Assistance, excuse me, of Financial Assistance. There's also some other common forms, the SF424A or C. What those are is those are the budget templates that the OMB comes out with standard form. The SF424A is the budget for non-construction type projects, whereas the SF424C is the budget that is used for construction type projects. So we'll talk about which form to use, when to use, and we'll show you a couple things how to fill out on it. There's also, if your project is construction in nature, which typically multi-state conservation grant program applications are generally not, but I'll let John and Lori and Silvana speak to that. If your project is construction based, there is a statement of assurances form, the SF424D, that you would want to include as part of your complete and full proposal. But again, if your project is non-construction based, then you do not need to submit that SF424D. We've mentioned previously, there's some required certification statements. We'll talk to you about those, show you what those look like. If you're going to charge indirect costs in your project and your grants, then there is some requirements that come into play about information we need to have submitted as part of your application that speaks to indirect costs. And then so part one, I divide that up. Those are more the common standard forms, the template forms. And then the other information that has to be, obviously we need a project summary from you, and then we need the overall project statement. Some people call it a project narrative, others call it a narrative, but basically it's the narrative documents your proposal. What do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? How you're going to do about it? Why it's so important to do it, and why you deserve the money more than anybody else. As part of that, and in pairing it up with the budget, we're going to want you also to include what we call a budget narrative. We'll talk about what the budget narrative is and what is the level of detail that should come into play on it. It's basically a narrative description that puts a little words to plate, if you will, about your budget. And then lastly, you're going to need to identify information about your project personnel and their qualifications for why they're qualified to do this work. So again, just go ahead and chime in your questions, but we'll keep going on. Here we go. Let's first talk about that SF424. This is the application for financial assistance. This is an OMB approved, we used to call them standard forms. Now we're calling them common forms. for all applicants to fill out when they're applying for federal grants and cooperative agreements. I know somebody asked a question about a private individual citizen applying for grants. There's a separate form that a private individual citizen would fill out, a different version of the SF424. But again, if you're not a private individual citizen, you're going to fill out the SF424 AFA. And this form is available whether you choose to apply in grants.gov or whether you choose to apply directly in Grant Solutions, our new financial management system. I would say the service, we are encouraging folks to apply directly in Grant Solutions to the best of your ability if you can. But if you're more comfortable applying in grants.gov, you can directly apply through grants.gov, and your application will transfer from grants.gov directly over into Grant Solutions. So both systems will satisfy correctly for applying. You'll notice here I've got a screenshot of box 18 on the field. This form is basically, I like to call it a plug and chug form, if you will. It's basically just got fields in it that you just enter information, or you click a drop down arrow and you select what is the most relevant piece of information relating to you, your organization, or your application. I chose box 18 here. One of the more common questions we often get from folks when they're filling out this form is where do I put various amounts in box 18, which is the estimated funding for the project. Now, I know the Multi-State Conservation Grant Program provides 100% funding. There's no mandatory match requirement. So it's a little bit simpler to fill this form out for multi-state compared to some of our other programs that require a match. But basically, you'll want to insert in box A only the federal amount of money you're requesting from the Multi-State Conservation Grant Program. If you're going to be doing your project and you're going to be getting money from other federal financial assistance programs, we don't want you to put those federal dollars from other federal programs beyond the multi-state program in box 18A. The only thing we want in 18A is the amount of money you are requesting directly from the Multi-State Conservation Grant Program. Okay, if you're going to provide some voluntary additional funds, again, there's no mandatory requirement, but if you're going to provide some voluntary cost share, as we say it in the world of financial assistance, that's if you're going to provide it, then you list that amount of your money you're providing as voluntary in box 18B, because you are providing it and you are the applicant. Now, one of the common questions we get is, well, if I'm a state agency, I'm also the applicant, so where should I put, the money that we're going to provide as voluntary match? We advise folks, even if you're a state agency, you are the applicant, and you should be putting any amount of money you're going to provide in the applicant share. The state share is meant to be designated for any funds that is going to be contributed to the project by other state agencies. D is provided there for any other funds to be provided by other local government entities. And then E is the box, the all-encompassing, all-inclusive box for all other entities. So again, that's one of the more common questions we get, hence we wanted to spend a little time speaking to it here on this training webinar. Okay, let's move over to the budget forms, the SF424A or C. Again, these are OMB approved common forms for budget information, the A being the budget information form for non-construction programs, and C being the budget information form for construction programs. I'm going to focus heavily on the SF424A, since most multi-state, the majority, as far as I was told, applications typically tend to be non-construction in nature. So this is the budget form that the federal government provides for applicants to populate. If you're curious, we have what I think is an outstanding training video. You'll see the link provided there on the screenshot. It'll walk you through start to finish, A to Z, cradle to grave, how to fill out that form and how to do it properly. So that's a really good resource to reference when you're filling this form out if you have questions. So let's talk real quick. Some of these we'll fly right over. Personnel category. So folks, this is where you would enter the estimated amount of funding for your total project, not just the federal share. If there's going to be other funds coming in, this is total from the multi-state program that are going to be needed for your organization's personnel costs to fulfill the project. Okay, and as we all know, personnel costs are typically the single most abundant costs applied to any financial assistance award. So again, that's where you enter in the dollars that it's going to cost your staff who are working on the project to fulfill the overall objective, and you identify how much multi-state money is needed for personnel costs. We provide a reference to you there, 2 CFR 200-430. That's where the uniform guidance speaks to what is and what is not considered personal services and financial assistance. And it also provides some really good information about the standards for what adequate documentation needs to be in the case of personnel services. So you might reference that. Moving down to B, this is where you enter the estimated amount of funds needed to pay fringe benefits of your employees performing activities of a grant. So we all know what fringe benefits are. They can vary from one organization to another. Typical examples of fringe benefit we see are costs of say, leave, Social Security payments, Medicare payments, pension cost payments, 401k payments, stuff like that. Each organization decides what their pension costs are. And so that's where you would enter this information. Typically, it's a percentage of your personnel costs, 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever percent that is. Moving down to C, this is where we ask you to enter the estimated amount of funds for travel costs of your employees performing activities of the proposed project. And so this is, again, travel costs for them while they're in official travel status designation, whether they're going to conferences, meetings, or whether they're in official travel status, perhaps when they're out doing field status work. That is where you would enter those travel costs for, say, things like lodging, mileage reimbursement, meals, and stuff like that. We provide you a reference to CFR 200-474 that has some really good information about what are the standards that come into play when we're talking about allowable travel costs. And there is also a one little sneaky area that you might want to reference in regulation that does require written approval from the federal awarding agency. Not all travel costs require prior written approval from the federal awarding agency, but there are a few minor areas you might want to just investigate and make certain you're not charging to your award. If you are, we just need to make certain that you put them in your application so that we can give prior written approval for them. All right, moving down to D, this is where we get to entering the estimated amount of funds for either equipment acquisition or depreciation that you need in order to fulfill the objectives of your project. The federal definition of equipment is items that meet tangible personal property with a useful life of greater than 1 year and a per unit acquisition costs of $5,000 or the acquisition threshold established by you as the recipient. So again, it's important to remember that we have some state fish and wildlife agencies, for example, who their state definition of equipment is $500. Well, in that case, they have to follow the lesser of either $5,000 or the state's definition. So in that case, that state would have to enter in information for equipment that had a per unit acquisition cost of $500 or more. So you got to enter that in there. It is important to know that direct charging of both general and special purpose equipment is generally unallowable as a direct charge to federal financial assistance awards, except with written approval from the federal awarding agency. So we're going to talk about how you pair up the dollar amounts you're putting in here in the budget with your budget narrative, so that the federal program WISP for the service, we know you're requesting approval to buy equipment, and we can give you that written approval so that you meet the requirements of regulation. So again, that's the dollar amounts, and that's what goes in equipment. If it doesn't meet the definition of equipment, that's where I say, okay, then it's a supply. So a lot of people ask, well, what's the definition of supply? I basically say everything that doesn't meet the definition of equipment. So that's where the next column, 6E, is where you enter estimated of funds for equipment acquisition and supply, or excuse me, supply acquisition. Moving down, contractual, this is where you enter the estimated amount of funds for any contractual costs needed for the activities of your proposed project. We want to draw a clear distinction, folks, between what a contract is versus a subaward. A contract is basically a legal instrument by which the applicant/recipient procures or purchases or obtains property or services that then you will use then to carry out and fulfill the overall federal award. In converse, a subaward is an award that the recipient provides to an entity that we call a subrecipient, whereby the subrecipient is actually the entity who is actually fulfilling the purpose of the federal award. So we're going to tell you in the case where you're subawarding funds, we're going to tell you to put those subawards down in H, the other category. Don't combine them in the contractual column. And there's a method for our madness why we're asking you to do this. But again, F is designed just to be and speak to budget amounts needed for contractual items. Again, G, I'll slide over it real quick. If you're not doing construction or those activities, you can just leave that blank. And then here's H, where you provide all other. If you didn't fit it in one of the previous budget categories, this is where it goes for all others, and you'll describe it in your budget narrative. But examples of things we often see in the multi-state program that you would put in other would be subaward amounts. Maybe you're going to have rental costs, printing costs, conference costs, training costs, relocation if you're hiring staff and you're going to pay them relocation assistance, or participant support costs. So that's where you would put all those there. I is going to automatically sum up all those if you're filling the form out electronically. And then we move down to J. This is where you enter in the amount of funds needed that for indirect costs allocable to your project. And as we all know, indirect costs are those costs that are difficult to assign to a direct cost benefit area. So they're basically, they're incurred for multiple purposes, and they're not easily or readily assignable to a cost objective without a lot of undue burden. So we just lump them in indirect costs, and recipients recover them through the application of their indirect rates. Okay. Any questions before we go? Actually, before I take questions, let me finish off one more slide. Page 3 of the form, we get a lot of questions on section D. Ryan, what the heck do we put in section D? And basically section D is where you estimate to the federal government how much federal, and if you're providing cost share, how much cost share funds, non-federal funds, you will need on a quarterly basis for the first year of the grant, okay? And so again, you know, most of multi-state awards start January 1 and they go through December 31st, they're one-year awards. You would basically want to estimate to the best of your ability how much federal funds do you anticipate needing in the first quarter of that year, the second quarter of the year, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter of the year. Now you might be saying, well, what does that matter, Ryan? Why do we need to put that in there? Well, it just note, folks, it's an estimate. You're not limited to it. If you need more money than you estimate, you could still go and draw more money. But this is basically how the federal government monitors its grant recipients. Is we should be monitoring you routinely throughout the life cycle of your award. And if we know, if you estimate to us on the front end that in the first quarter you're going to need $50,000 in federal funds, then as part of our monitoring, we should be able to go into ASAP, the payment system, at the end of the first quarter of your award, and we should be able to do a comparison. Are you close to what you estimated? Are you under? Are you over? If you're dramatically or significantly over or significantly under, that might trigger an email inquiry. Hey, we're just checking on you. We noticed you estimated you said you'd only need 50,000. You've used far less. We just want to make certain that the project is still moving ahead as planned. So it's basically this section D here allows federal awarding agencies to do a little bit of what I like to call light level monitoring, if you will. Before I leave, I just want to do a real quick walkthrough. Remember, any and all costs you enter in on this budget form must follow the characteristics for allowable costs charged to federal awards. I have them all listed here up on the screen. This is all in regulation, but basically any cost charged to a federal award must meet all, not just one of these criteria. So, i.e., those costs must be necessary and reasonable. I have the picture of the souped out cop car up there. That's probably, well, maybe in Italy, that's a necessary and reasonable form of a cop car, but probably in other countries, they get by with a lot less, if you will. So the cost has to be necessary and reasonable. It's got to conform to any requirements of 2 CFR 200 or terms and conditions of the federal award. You've got to treat the cost consistently within your organization, whether it's using federal funds or non-federal funds. It's got to be treated consistently within the same grant. It's got to be in alignment and in accord with GAAP, generally accepted accounting practices. It can be an allowable cost charged to the award as long as it's not included as a cost to another federal award. We call that the case of double dip. If the federal government pays for one cost twice, that's the double dip. And if you're a Seinfeld fan, there's that famous episode where George double dips his chip and gets caught on it. And then the last two items, the cost must be adequately documented. So you've got to have source documentation if ever questioned on it. And then in the case where your grant is approved with budget periods, which I don't believe Mulitstate is, it's got to be incurred within the approved budget period. So with that, I'll pause. Yona, any questions that we have? I see Silvana is feverishly answering most of them, so I appreciate that.
Let's see. So there is a question from Susan. The entity that I'm with is the WAFWA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Does that mean we need to get our own UEI, or do we use that of WAFWA's? Then Silvana was clarifying with her if the entity is a nonprofit. She says, I think so. We're newly formed, so we don't have an FEIN or nonprofit status yet. So let's see. So it looks like Silvana said, so you have to apply through WAFWA or through a nonprofit. It's in the eligibility screening questions. So it looks like that one is answered.
Okay.
And then let's see, Tanya chimed in. The MAFWA R3 committee applies on behalf of MAFWA, not as a different nonprofit entity. Not sure if that's helpful. Sounds helpful to me. And then let's see, we had another one. Let's see, from Marlise Douglas. Difference between C and H: if hired staff goes to a conference, it's budgeted under travel. But if a conference is organized for participants, it's budgeted under other?
I guess I'm not fully understanding the question. I apologize. But again, the travel costs under C, and I clicked back a couple slides. Again, that's meant to be travel costs, lodging, airfare, meals, and per diem. While your staff are actually at the conference, obviously they're charging time, they're coding their timesheet. Keep that all up in personnel. The travel is solely meant to be just for things like airfare, mileage reimbursement, lodging, food reimbursement, stuff like that, but not necessarily personnel time, if that makes sense.
Ryan, can I chime in with that?
Okay.
So we have a grant with AFWA which sponsors the director's travels, but also someone from Alpha staff will travel too. So that Alpha staff that travel, it's charged in travel. But when we sponsor the directors, which are not who are not part of the staff,
Yeah,
we were required to charge that to the others. That changed this year. Actually, we used to do it differently before. But
and so I think that's the additional question I need an answer. So yeah, remember, personnel costs is meant to be those costs of the applicant's employees. If as part of your grant, the grant funds are going to pay for somebody else's time and travel to a meeting, then I could definitely see that information being entered in travel. I would defer to how does AFWA want that information provided. So I could see both ways in that.
Right, Ryan, this is John Bloom. I think what she meant was we're paying travel benefits, travel costs on behalf of non-employees.
Yes.
So what the guidance we received from Ruth, I believe, was put that in the other category. So travel is specific to employees.
That's right.
Not an employee goes in the other field.
Yes, yeah, and I can see that definitely. And again, what we always teach in training, John, is again, we will justify and you know, circle back to all these costs as part of the budget narrative, but I can definitely see her guidance on that. Yes. And knowing that that clears up the question to me, I would concur with Ruth's recommendation on that one. Thanks, John.
All right. Okay, thanks all. So we had another question from Swanee Evans. Will you go into a little more detail on subawards versus contractual? Where exactly is where is that exact delineation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and arguably the single most challenging topic in financial assistance out there right now is this regulatory requirement to distinct between an entity as a contractor versus as a subrecipient. I'd encourage you to come see us at some of our other trainings, our advanced grants management training, where we, believe it or not, as painful as this might sound, we spend about 3 hours alone on that topic. So it's going to be tough for me to answer it here in brevity, but basically the difference is, let me click back to contractual. Basically, contracts are when you are procuring an item or a service that will come to you, and then your organization, you as the recipient, you're still the entity fulfilling the purpose and the objectives of the federal award. Where we get to a sub-recipient or a sub-award status is where your organization as the applicant, you receive an award, you are now the recipient, and you choose to pass monies to another entity, and they're the one that is actually going to fulfill the objectives of the award. So that one of the easiest ways I like to explain this is, let's say you get an award from the Mulitstate program to do a research project, okay? And then you enter into a relationship with another entity, and they're the ones who is actually going to go out. They're the one that is actually going to collect the samples. They're the one that is actually going to analyze the data. They're the one that is actually going to take that data and put it into a report with possibly management recommendations, and then they provide you that back. In that case, who's the entity actually fulfilling the objective of the federal award? It's not the recipient at that moment in time. It's actually the entity you subawarded your funds with. So again, there's the difference, is who is actually fulfilling the purpose of the federal award. That's one of the biggest characteristics. Conversely, let's take that same scenario. You get an award from Mulitstate. You're going to do a research project, but your staff go out and collect the samples. But maybe you don't have the software systems, or maybe your staff don't have the capacity to do statistical analysis. So you enter into an agreement with a third party, maybe a university, maybe a professor, whereby you're going to hand them the data that your staff collected. That entity is going to do some type of statistical analysis to it. they provide you the results back, and then your staff pick back up, and your staff are the ones who actually look at the results of the statistics. Your staff are the ones who actually write up a report and come to some type of management decision on it. In that case, I would argue that the university, the professor, they were simply just providing you a service that then came back to your organization, and your organization, you, the recipient, your employees, you still were the one filling out the purpose of the federal award. So again, that's kind of a quick nuts and bolts. I'd love to go into more detail, but I know we're time limited. I'm going to provide my email address at the end of this webinar. I'll also have John and Lori's email. I'll also have the other members of the training branch on here, Mike Sawyer's. Feel free to reach out to us. We can go into a lot more detail. We can provide you some side-by-side characteristics about what is a contractor versus a subrecipient, and you might find that more beneficial. So hopefully that's a teaser of enough information to get you by right now. Anything else, Yona?
Let's see, the only other one I see was a question, but it looks like Silvana answered it. It was about cost share. Cost share is not required, correct? But is it still, is it a scoring criteria? And Silvana answered, not required, not a scoring criteria.
Yep, good. Okay, good deal. All right, thank you. All right, I'll move on. Okay, let's really quick talk. How are we doing on time? Longer than I thought. Let's talk about the required statements. There's a handful of required statements. Make certain you include them in your application. On the AFL website, it says it's preferred that you provide them on your organization's official letterhead. But I'm pretty certain we'll take them any way, shape, or form you can get them to us. So let's talk about the first one. This is a requirement of the law, the code, if you will, that authorizes the multi-state program both in the Wildlife Restoration Act and the Sportfish Restoration Act. So I have those citations to where they are in the code, but as required by law, your organization must provide the following certifications, and I've provided you them on the screen. So there's 2 certifications you have to make, and it's basically just your organization certification that you will not use grant funds to fund any activity that promotes or encourages opposition to the regulated hunting or trapping of wildlife, the regulated taking of fish, and now that we have a new R3 multi-state conservation grant program, we have the 3rd statement, or to the opposition of recreational shooting activities. So make certain your organization certifies to that. And not that you just certify to it, that you actually follow through and don't use the funds for any of those activities. Okay, you will also be required to provide to us a single audit statement as part of your full proposal to us. And there's 3 types of certification statements you can provide to us. You can either say that our organization was required to submit a single audit report to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and it's either up there or it's not up there, or you can certify that your organization was not required to have a single audit in your organization's most recently closed fiscal year. So basically the audit threshold is, did your organization receive expend $750,000 or more in federal funds in your organization's fiscal year. So if you're getting $750,000 or more in federal funds in a fiscal year and expending it, then you are required to have a single audit done for that fiscal year. And this is how we go out and check whether you had that single audit done. And if you did, we then are required as part of our pre-award risk assessment to go out and look at, were there any issues or concerns identified by the auditors as part of that audit. So again, WISPR uses this as part of our pre-award risk assessment plan. So that's the single audit statement. Circle back now to indirect costs. There's a handful of indirect cost statements. Federal financial assistance awards and federal awarding agencies are required to honor indirect costs when entities have them. So these first 2 I have up here, these are only for if you are a state or local government entity. If you're a nonprofit, do not use one of these 2. I'll show you the ones you use. okay? But states or local government entities, you simply select between one of two types. Did you receive more than 35 million in direct federal funding each year? And if you have an indirect rate, then you go ahead and insert that indirect rate. If you haven't negotiated that indirect rate and you don't have an approved negotiated rate, then you have to have a negotiated rate from your cognizant agency. So once you have it, if you have it at the time of your application, you include a copy of that if it's not already in WSPR's hands. If you are a state or local government entity that receives 35 million or less, then you select that second bullet. And depending on your cognizant agency for indirect costs, you may be allowed a little bit of grace by not having to negotiate your indirect cost rate. You just might have to have the indirect cost rate proposal developed and on hand and available if ever questioned or needed under audit. However, if your cognizant agency for indirect costs is Department of Interior and you negotiate with Interior Business Center, they do want, even if you get less than 35 million, they require you to submit your indirect cost rate for negotiation. So just know that if your cognizant agency is Interior Business Center. Okay, all other organization types beyond states, these next 5, I've got 3 of them up here. These are the bullets that you choose from. So bullet number 1 is basically just saying that we are an organization and we might have an indirect cost rate. And if we do, we are attaching it and our indirect cost rate is X. Or you're an organization that has never negotiated your indirect cost rate with a federal cognizant agency. Your indirect is X, and you will submit and negotiate with the cognizant agency within 90 calendar days of the award. So that's your first bullet point, okay? Second bullet point is if you've never ever submitted an indirect cost rate proposal to your cognizant agency, this is where you would select that one and you say, hey, we have an indirect rate. It's not negotiated yet, but we will do it within 90 days. Option 3 has been a little bit modified. This is a little bit outdated language because we've recently had an update to 2 CFR 200. But option 3, bullet point 3 here allows entities to have rates lower than 10%, and you can use that lower than rate, or you can also use what is called a 10% de minimis. And some people might have heard of that one. That freedom has opened up a little bit. It used to be that once you had an indirect rate, you were no longer eligible to use the de minimis. OMBs relaxed that a little bit, and they just say if you do not have a current approved negotiated indirect rate, the 10% de minimis is back on the table for you. So that's what bullet point 3 there is for. Bullet point 4 is if you've never submitted an indirect cost rate proposal and your agency has a rate higher than 10%, you can do that, but then you're going to have to negotiate it and get that approved by your cognizant agency. Or again, you could use the 10% de minimis. And then we see the last bullet point there being, hey, we're not going to charge any indirect costs on this award. We're just going to apply everything as a form of a direct cost. So you'll have to make certain you select one of these bullet points that's most representative of how your application and your organization wants to treat indirect costs. And indirect costs is a complex topic. If you have questions about it, you want to go into further detail, give me or give Mike or give Lori or John a call. We can walk you through in a little bit more detail what indirect costs are and what they aren't. If you've never seen your organization's negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, this is an example of one that came back from Interior Business Center to our friends at North Carolina Wildlife Resource Agencies. Again, we're going to need to see copies of this for indirect costs. The most important piece of information on this is under section 1 below. This identifies to us what type of indirect cost rate the entity has, in this case fixed with carry forward. We see what their approved rate is valid from. So again, this is a little bit dated, but it was valid from July 1, 2014 through June 30, 2015. We see what their rate is. So North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission had a rate of 75.2%. And then the explanation of what do they apply that 75.2 to? They apply it to total direct salaries and wages only. And knowing that justifies to me why their rate is so high, because they're only applying their indirect costs to the most narrowest form of direct costs, i.e. salaries and wages. Okay. Any questions about indirect costs? And let's see. So I see Silvana had a question. So the change with indirect costs this year is that even if you had an indirect cost before, but it expired, you still can charge. Yes, that is the freedom. As long as your rate is expired, you do not have a current negotiated rate, the de minimis is now back on the table for entities that are eligible to use it. Okay. Another one, third statement is because these are discretionary funds, you are required to submit what is called the overlap or duplication statements. So oftentimes applicants will submit a project idea that's eligible for funding under multiple federal programs. I like to say it's a shotgun approach. Put your application out there under multiple federal programs and see which one you get an approval from. If you do that, if your application has also been submitted for other federal assistance programs, you need to state that to us in our application so that we are aware of that. And so if no, obviously just say no, this is the only federal program we've applied for funding for this idea. If you are shotgunning it, if you will, then you say yes. And then there's also some language in there that we recommend is at any point in time you receive funding from another source that is duplicative of the funding you're requesting from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, you need to re-engage with us and let us know that so that we make certain that federal programs aren't paying for the same costs. Conflict of interest statement. I think we're all pretty much familiar with this, but applicants just note that you must state in your application if you are aware of any actual or note the word potential conflict of interests that exists at the time of submission. When you're subawarding funds to a subrecipient, this requirement rolls on downhill to your subrecipients, and they're supposed to report any actual or potential conflict of interests. I think we all know what conflict of interests are. These are things might be, maybe you're subawarding some of these funds that your organization got to another entity, and maybe your spouse is the president or the CFO of that other organization. That could be a potential conflict of interest that needs to be disclosed. That's just one example of a conflict of interest. Okay. All right, we're moving along, almost done. Got about a handful more slides here. Let's talk about what goes in the grant proposal information, and I'm going to walk you through the template that AFRA provides on their website that I mentioned on slide 2. This is the template that a couple folks had questions on early in, and we highly recommend that you follow this template so that the AFRA Grants Review Committee kind of has everybody on the same page, look and feel. So let's just quickly walk through what some of these important areas are, and then we'll open it up for general Q&A questions. We see on this template, you'll see section 1 is where you provide your grant title, your proposal title. There's area there for you to identify your location, and then the start and ending dates of your grant. Most multi-state awards are one-year awards, so you could probably just go ahead and insert January 1 through December 31st in there. Under section 5 of subsection I is for your public description or your summary statement, if you will. Remember, there was the requirement that you summarize your project. Then you'll identify some grant recipient contact information. Subsection 2 is where you check the box, which grant program is your proposal requesting funding from? Are you requesting money from the wildlife restoration side of the multi-state program, the sport fish side of the multi-state program, or the new R3 side of the multi-state program. So remember, each of those has certain eligibility criteria, what types of projects can and cannot be funded out of them. So make certain you identify the appropriate source of funding for your project. You can select more than one. Notice it says check all that apply. We have some project types that have both eligibility components to it under wildlife and sport fish. So again, you can get funding from both on that. Under Section 3, this is where you identify what type of organization type you are. Are you a nonprofit organization? Are you a state and local government? Or are you a university? Or are you the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or a state, which we already mentioned? Below that, so the last part is where you identify, remember, to be eligible for funding under the multi-state program, it must either benefit at least 26 states, or it must benefit a majority, over 50% of the states in a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service region, or it must benefit a majority of states, over 50% of the states that belong to a regional association of state fish and wildlife agencies. And note what we're talking about there. This is WAFWA, Western Association, MAFWA, Midwest Association, NEAFWA, Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and then SEFWA, the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So identify which one of those check boxes or criteria your application and your project is meeting. We move on to 3. This is where you will identify that your project meets and applies to which of the various 2020 AFWA determined strategic priorities, and those strategic priorities are listed on AFWA's website. See, there's that conflict of interest disclosure. You could put it in here, or you could have it, you could check the box whether it was not applicable or whether it applies. Then we move down to your project statement information. And again, knowing some people call this the project narrative, just they're all one and the same, used interchangeably. This is where your project statement title may or may not be the same title as your overall grant. We see some applicants who have multiple project statements under one grant, and each project statement has its own unique title. We see other applications where it's one grant is one project statement, and the grants and the project statement title are one and the same. So again, it's up to you. We see variability out there. Just you have the freedom to do whatever you want. Excuse me. Identify the geographic location where the project's going to take place. And then Yona and Meg talked a little bit yesterday about tracks groups. We won't go into too much on that. I think we'll be providing some more information in the future on what this will really be. But this is where you'll just want to identify what tracks group this project's going to belong to. Typically, that might just be your organization's name. 4, we'll talk about it's where you populate information about the point of contact. And then now we move down to the meat and potatoes of what Training Branch really likes to call where how you sell your project. This is where you'll provide us your need and your purpose statement. The need statement is what we like to call, this is whatever conservation issue or problem or opportunity is facing your organization that you want to address using multi-state conservation grant program funding. So again, this is what is eating your lunch, what is eating the state's lunch, what conservation problem can we solve if we fund this type of project. You'll also want to provide some additional information in there about how does this project perhaps fulfill the overall need of the multi-state conservation grant program. That further helps justify why your project is valuable as it is and deserves to be funded. The purpose should be at an overall higher level. What is the overall purpose of this grant? What do you hope to accomplish as a result of this project? Then we move down into the objectives. I won't go into that too much. Yona and Meg did a fantastic job talking to you about how the service is broaching a new system, the track system, and how we're doing a cultural shift in how we're asking our applicants to write their grant objectives, moving away more from what used to be the narratively based type of objective and trying to guide folks into using tracks standard objectives so that the system, when we get these data calls from various congressional inquiries, manufacturers, industry, the public, other stakeholders, how we can more responsibly respond and answer data calls to some of the more common questions that we typically get asked. So again, Yona and Meg talked a little bit about that. Lots of tracks resources out there. We'll just kind of park it at that right now in the interest of time. Move down to dates of completion for your objective. Is this objective an R3 activity? The various activity tag 1s and tag 2s pertaining to each objective. Moving on to page 3 of the template proposal, you'll identify if it's a research project, who the principal investigator is. What's the target species and or habitat types for certain types of projects, i.e. if you're doing direct habitat and species management, certain research projects, stuff like that. And then here's where we get to now the approach. And folks, if they're coming from a trainer, I could say this: if there's one section of this project statement where you shouldn't skimp or try to cut corners on, it's the approach. We like to advise folks, this is where you really paint the clearest picture about from start to finish. What all are you really wanting to do? How are you going to go about doing it? And how do you get set up from A to Z so that you can finish the project in an efficient time manner? That's what the approach section is. As a trainer, I like to teach folks that the approach should almost be written to a level of detail, whereas think of it this way: if the project leader were to disappear tomorrow on your project, and you hypothetically hired Ryan, boy, you'd be hitting the bottom of the barrel at that moment in time. But if you hired me, I should be able to come into your organization, pick up this project statement application, read through the objectives, read through the approach, and I should be able to pick up where that project leader left off from day one. So again, that's where we really encourage folks. If there's one area, don't hesitate to write a little bit more as opposed to less. It's that narrative section. Then we move down to provide some results and benefits. What is the overall result and benefit? What is the multi-state program? What is AFWA? What does the service get as a result of us approving this application? And in training, we like to encourage folks, you can think about results and benefits from a variety of aspects. Some of those aspects include, what are the expected benefits to the resources, to the fins, to the furs, to the feathers out there if your project directly relates to one of those? Also, what's the results and benefits to the resource, to the habitat out there if your project relates to that? Other things you could think about: what's the direct results and benefits to the users out there? How will hunters, anglers, recreational shooters, perhaps or wildlife watchers, how will they benefit from this project being funded and your successful implementation to it? So think about that as ways you can provide some documentation and justification as to the results and benefits of your project. All right, last couple things, moving down to budget narrative. So again, this is where we want you to add a narrative, if you will, that's going to really describe those dollar amounts that you put in each of those various budget categories on the SF424A and the associated budget that's included with this template that AFRA likes to have. So for example, you're then going to go about talking about, you're going to provide a narrative section. You listed dollar amounts for personnel costs. We basically want you to describe, okay, we'll put some meat and potatoes behind. You put $80,000 in personnel costs. What does that mean? And, you know, examples of stuff we see are people saying, well, we're going to have X number of staff working on this project. Those staff are titled various titles. This is their baseline salary figures that we pay those people. And this is the roughly the estimated amount of time. 60% of their time they're going to be working on this project. So you're basically providing us a narrative description to explain why $80,000 was entered in personnel costs. Another category we might talk about is equipment. Remember, we talked about that. And remember, I said equipment acquisition is generally an unallowable cost as a direct charge, except with the prior written approval of the federal awarding agency. So if you're going to need to procure and acquire equipment and charge that to the federal award, we would highly encourage you to denote in your budget narrative that hey, we need to acquire this piece of equipment and it roughly costs X. We need to require Y piece of equipment and it costs X. So go ahead and list all those pieces of equipment that you're going to acquire that are necessary and reasonable for the fulfillment of the project, so that when we approve this award by de facto, we have then approved your organization's ability to charge those costs directly to the federal award. Again, other budget category costs, contractual subaward. If you're subawarding funds, we would really want you to, if it's not already clearly described in the approach, you would want to identify who the subaward is going to, and a little bit of narrative description about why you're subawarding the funds to them, why you're doing that, maybe the estimated dollar amount, stuff like that. Again, you're just putting narrative description to work hand in hand with the budget. And then let's move on to additional fields, timelines. There's really no hard and fast rule about what a timeline has to be, but in training branch, we often teach if your award is a 1-year grant, 1-year period of performance, think about, okay, well, what are those milestone events that you're going to reach throughout the duration of that award, and think about your timeline that way. Maybe you break your timeline down into quarterly sections. So you say within the first 3 months, we hope to be 35% done with the project. And at that point, we will have completed A, B, C. Then by the end of the next quarter, you would say we hope to be 52% done with the project. And in addition to those things that were completed in the first quarter, we want to also be done with D, E, F, and G. So think about that. But again, knowing it doesn't have to be broken out by quarter, you could break your timeline into a 6-month interval if that more blends with your project. Just look at your overall project and try to figure out what those important timelines are. Moving on to budgets, this is the budget that AFWA asks for in their template. So you'll see it's very, very similar to the SF424A, but you'll see they do specifically break out contractual amounts. So if you're going to issue contracts, noting they've got some examples for contract 1, contract 2, contract 3, yada, 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 if you have more. And then they've got that other category. So again, you're just trying to help the reviewers clearly understand what the budgeted costs of the overall project are going for. You can sum up the total direct costs. If you're going to apply your indirect rate, notice AFWA puts in there a note. They ask for a voluntary cap of 20% indirect costs charged to the Multi-State Conservation Grant Program. And then you'll notice at the bottom, total expenses, and then this is where you would break it out in the case where your project is going to get funding from more than one of the multi-states. You would then parse out how much of the overall total project is coming from the SFR multi-state program versus the wildlife versus the R3 part of the program. Almost done, last slide, then you'll enter information about your key qualifications for your personnel on your application. And then we'll just go ahead and end this with time for questions here. Just want to drive home a point. Remember, folks, full proposals must be submitted by July 20th, 2021. I believe Silvana has a deadline of 5 p.m. Eastern time as when the clock strikes 12. And applications must be submitted both to AFWA through their application portal. You'll see the website listed there on the screen, as well as we need that application submitted to the service via either grantsolutions.gov or grants.gov. We always encourage applicants, please do not wait until the last minute to submit your application. The systems, they're like any other system out there, folks. They could have bugs, they could go offline. It could be beyond our control and responsibility. So we do advise folks, please do not wait until July 20th at 4 p.m. Eastern time to go ahead and submit those applications, because you're running the risk that the system might go offline or might go down, or that there is a bug in the system. So again, try to submit those as early as possible. There's never a penalty for submitting an application early. And with that, I'm about done. I'm parched. I just want to put up a few contact pieces of emails and staff. Please feel free to reach out to Silvana. She's a wonderful resource. She can answer any and all question you might have with AFWA. If you have a question and you want to reach out to the Fish and Wildlife Service, I've got several contacts here listed for you. John Strempel, Lori Bennett, they are the grants management folks who actually are the ones with the service who administer and are the national leads for the multi-state program. John Strempel, national lead for the multi-state program. So if you got any questions, feel free to reach out to either Lori or John. Tracks questions, you won't find two more knowledgeable folks about the system to answer your questions than Yona and Meg, and we've got their emails listed up there. And then lastly, the training branch, Michael Sawyers and myself, Ryan Oster, we are happy to answer any questions you might have about broad federal financial assistance, indirect costs, applications, you name it, whatnot. If we don't know the answer, we will go find the answer for you and get back to you as soon as we can. We are here to help and hope that we're able to be value added. So with that, I am about done. And I think we've got about a half hour left for questions, either from day one or day two. Yona, any questions?
Let's see. So there was a question from Scott Williamson. Is the AFWA 20% cap translating to 20% of direct costs or 20% of modified direct costs? And I think someone answered that with MDC.
So the answer to that question would be, well, I'm going to defer to AFWA on this, but generally a cap 20% is the cap based upon whatever the entity's approved indirect cost base is. So it depends. The answer is it depends. What is your indirect cost base? Is your base salaries? Is your base salaries and fringe? Or is your base modified total direct cost? So the 20% cap should be applied to whatever the entity's approved base is in their NICRA. Or if they don't have an approved NICRA and they choose the 10% de minimis, then indeed the 20% limitation is based on MTDC, modified total direct cost.
Okay, thanks. And then there's another question from Lisa Parks regarding geographic location. What if the work is being conducted electronically remotely and benefiting all 50 states? Do we list the applicant's main office location?
So yeah, Lisa, if you're asking, you know, on as part of the application in the geographic location, this is where an entity would normally say where the work is being done, where the field work is being done. In your case, if you're saying your project is entirely electronically based, there's no field work, for example, or whatnot. I'm gonna defer to Silvana and John on this, but it does seem logical to me that you would list where the work is being done. And in your case, you're saying the work is being done at a computer terminal, and so you should list where that computer terminal and you are located. Would be my best management recommendation.
To my understanding is what states are benefiting. So if it's done virtually and all 50 states are benefiting, then you will include all 50 states. And for the office location, that would be the very first part where it's like
Right,
where the office is located. So
right,
in the proposal detail. And then when you
right.
go down to the beneficiary information, then you just have to list which states are participating in this virtual program.
Right, right. So Lisa, I just want to make certain we're understanding your question. I agree. You know, I wasn't certain what part of the project statement your question was referring to. If you were referring to up at the top, number 2, recipient location, that should be where you as the recipient are located. Okay. I think what Silvana talked about, the benefiting states, that's where you identify those down in subsection 3.2. You identify the benefiting states and you list those states. And then again, over here under project statement, this is where, again, I would need more information to answer. But if you're saying you're the only one doing the work, yes, it's going to benefit all those other states. But I think this is in geographic location here. This is where I would recommend you identify where the actual work is happening, noting that you've identified the benefiting states previously in the previous section. So I hope that helps. But again, if more than one state is doing the computer work, then yes, I would think you would want to denote all of those locations that are physically working on the award, if that's your question. Any other questions, Yona?
Let's see. Looks good. Okay, so then for Marlies, is it possible to get the reviewers' comments for pre-proposals that were not invited for a full proposal?
Yes, if you are requesting them. So this feedback will be sent to whoever the lead applicant is, and there are a bunch of other applicants in the application. So the lead applicant will have to share that information, but they will have to request the feedback.
Good deal. Anything else?
That looks like all the questions I'm seeing in the chat. Doug posted a nice list of all 50 states abbreviations with DC. Anyone needs that?
All right. Well, I think we've got just a hair under 30 minutes left. Again, I'm happy to stay on, and I think we've got Yona and Meg here as well. We've got Silvana, John, Lori, fantastic resources. We could open it up to any other questions. I'm going to stop sharing my.
Hi, this is Susan. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Hey, I put this question in the chat. It was similar to Marlis's question. So let's say we submit a full proposal and we're not awarded funds. Will we be able to see those reviewers' comments and feedback?
I'm going to defer to Silvana and John on that.
Yes, the same as the initial proposals. If you receive a email that your proposal wasn't approved and you just reply back and say, I would like to see the feedback, you will receive the feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. It's always good to get feedback to continually improve on proposals. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, oh, I saw one come in here through the chat. Let's see. Again, I'm gonna defer this to the experts. Silvana, John, and Lori, do you have a guesstimate how many of the 50+ invited full proposals may be funded?
It's really hard to say at this point. If we will go like to how much funds are available, probably around 50. Some of the teams decide that the full proposal is not like doesn't really have a merit. It needs more improvement, and they might ask for next year and may request that you submit next year with improvement. So I would say between like 47 and 50.
And all varies based on how much money they're asking for as well.
Yeah, and
yeah.
like
Yeah, that's correct.
it might be that some will ask for less in the full grant proposal phase, and that might enable more proposals to make it through. So we really are not sure.
Yeah. And just a reminder, folks, we've got the last couple of years, we've got more money in the multi-state program. So Silvana, John, correct me if I'm wrong. We on the table we've got up to $11 million, right? We've got $5 million in the R3 multi-state program. So there's $5 million for that, and then $3 million each to the traditional multi-state program. $3 million coming from the wildlife restoration, and $3 million coming from sport fish. So if we add those up, 3 + 3 + 5 is $11 million total dollars that's on the table for folks.
Let me mention that this year and next year are going to be a year where the national surveys getting a little bit more out of that pot. So it's really just like 2.5 million available. And I see another question from Susan, and since I'm talking, I'm going to answer that. Can we ask for more money in the full proposal if we underestimate it in the pre-proposal? I highly discourage it. We cannot say you cannot do that, but if you ask for more, chances that the reviewers will approve that proposal might be a little bit lower.
Right, and the other thing too, this is John, is as AFWA kind of goes through the proposals and ranks them and stuff, you have a number of proposals that are 50% wildlife, 50% sport fish, and so they might have a tendency to run out of sport fish side or the wildlife side. So that kind of determines what's available too as they go through.
Yep. Yeah. Good clarification, John. Thank you for that. Good questions everybody's asking. All right. Well, with that, I think we're good to go. Like I said, I've never been to a training before where anybody complained about ending 20 minutes early. So with that, I thank everybody for your participation. I thank you for your interest in the Multi-State Conservation Grant Program. We really look forward to seeing these full proposals. As we mentioned, as you're working on your full proposal, doing tracks translation of objectives, or putting together your application, and you might have financial assistance questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. So Silvana, the staff with the service and the WISPER program, we're here to help. We want to make certain that all these proposals are to the best of their ability. And like I said, we look forward to seeing everybody's full proposal. So with that, I think, folks, you're welcome to leave the meeting. And thank you very much for your participation. All right. Yona, can you click the stop recording?